And hello, everyone. Welcome to the final seminar of our series. And I see a lot of new faces, especially members of the public in the audience. So I wanted to mention what this is. This is part of pretty much every Friday in term time, we have a nature seminar here open to the public. If you want to know more about them, just go into the University Biodiversity Network. So if you just Google Oxford Biodiversity Events, you'd find it. And we'll see our program. We're just about to announce our program for next term. It's a mixture of nature writers, ecologists, philosophers, every aspect of the natural world that we try and cover in there. So you're all welcome to come along to that. And actually, just for our metrics, if you're not currently a member of the University of Oxford, could you just raise your hand just to get an idea of how many members of the public have come? That's about. I'm seeing about 30 or 35. That's great. That's just to get an idea. That's fantastic. So you're very welcome. Do come to the rest of our series as well. Okay, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Charles Foster, who I'm very impressed that he's a winner of the Ig Nobel Prize for Biology, and has written a number of books, including Being a Beast, Being a Human, The Screaming Sky, which is the topic today, which is I absolutely recommend as an absolutely mesmerizing book about the topic you'll hear about today, and the Cry of the Wild. And he's got a few other interesting ones on the way we were just discussing. And he's a fellow of Exeter College in law. And so it has a vicarious range of interests, but we'll hear particularly about his obsession with swifts. So welcome, Charles.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here. That's an extravagantly generous introduction, which is going to leave you all crushingly disappointed. So I'll begin with an apology. And I'll go on with an acknowledgement of my nervousness in being here for a number of reasons. There are lots of serious scientists in this room. I'm neither a scientist nor particularly serious. I'm also embarrassed about speaking in a centre that has the name environment in its name for this reason, that I have a deep suspicion, I'm afraid, because of the notion of the environment. I think it's a corrosive idea. It conveys the idea that the environment, which is something we're supposed to care desperately about and spend lots of strenuous time and money preserving, is something outside us rather than something of which we are part and which is part of us. I also, because of my nervousness, ought to start by confessing that I am a thoroughgoing anthropomorphist. And lots of things that I'm going to be saying about swifts will raise your hackles if you are a serious scientist. The American biologist Carl Safina said that anthropomorphism is a good first guess as to what any non-human animal is feeling. That's my view. It'd be surprising if it were otherwise. We share all our evolutionary history with non-human animals. We share an awful lot of our physiological and neurological software and hardware. It will be a great surprise if what I feel doesn't relate in some way to what a fox or a swift feels, and vice versa. So anthropomorphism, a good first guess, almost certainly a very bad second guess, almost certainly a terrible third guess, but that's a legitimate place to start. It's become legitimate in the academy over the last 15 years or so to talk about animal emotion again, just as Darwin did in far and away the most important book he ever wrote, not The Origin of Species, but his book on animal emotion, 1872. Take it down from the shelves, dust it off. There are no slides here for a deliberate reason. It's not because I'm too lazy to produce a PowerPoint. It's because I want to tell a story. And pictures are hugely more powerful than any words which I can generate and would detract from that story. Why do I want to tell a story? It's because ultimately only stories convince and change. So this is an institute which is concerned with changing attitudes, with transforming the world. You can only do that by telling stories. I don't believe in climate change. And what I mean by that is that I can't bring myself to feel sufficiently about something as big and as terrifying and as abstract as climate change. I can't bring myself to relate to those awful pie charts and graphs. I can't bring myself to care sufficiently about mass extinction because it's too big and it's too far away from me. I'm a little local being, and I'm only convinced by little local stories. So tell me about the fate of the newt in the pond at the bottom of my garden and how that's affected by climate change, and I will be transformed. Tell me about the extinction of all the wolves in Kazakhstan, and I'm going to remain untouched. So that's why I want to tell stories. So let me begin self-indulgently by telling you how my relationship to Swifts started. And it wasn't to do with Swifts at all. It was to do with the prejudices, the colonial prejudices of a 6-year-old boy, Alf Foster, growing up in a little garden in Sheffield. So there was a blackbird in that back garden, which was like surrounded by privet hedges. And it looked at me and I looked at it. It had a yellow eye, unusually for a blackbird, with a black pupil. And as we looked at one another, I knew that it knew something about that place, that garden, that domain, which was my domain, that I didn't know. And I was enraged by that. I wanted to know what it knew that I didn't. And so I set about trying to find out whether I could know anything about its knowledge, and therefore could benefit from its insight about my world. So I tried things which probably sound to you to be really perverted. But before I did that, and I'll tell you about those in a moment, I tried more conventional things. When I came back from school, I went round the privet hedges, mapping the nests, counting the eggs. I mapped the flight paths of the blackbirds across the garden. I picked up fragments of eggshell. I stuffed a blackbird, I scraped off the road, suspended it on a thread, so that the very last thing that I saw before I fell asleep was a circling blackbird. Its brain went into a little container of formalin, and I went to sleep holding the blackbird's brain. This is the perverted bit. I'm hoping that some of the wisdom about my world of that blackbird would seep out through its brain into my fingers as I slept. You think it's weird, but of course it's actually standard shamanic practice. So that is the direct encounter way in which most human beings, for most of our evolutionary history, have tried to relate to the natural world, not by collecting data, but by hoping that something of that animal is going to seep into them and transform them. So blackbirds were my entry into the natural world. And then at about the age of 7 or 8, I was looking at my beloved house martins circling over the school field. And then in the sky, immediately above those house martins, I saw something else which was of a completely different order of being. It was orders of magnitude faster. It was plainly better designed by God or by natural selection or whatever. It was martial, military in its efficiency. It turned far faster than my beautifully aerial house martins. These, of course, were the Swifts. I ran back and I opened up my AA Reader's Digest book of British birds. The older members of the audience will remember that, and I found out what these birds were. And I was infected with a passion for these extraordinary animals, which has persisted. But it would have gone wrong, I think, for me if I had worshipped them for the rest of my life in the way that I worshipped and that first encounter. Because I think I'd have started to worship power. I think they'd turned me into a fascist. But fortunately, as I've admitted to you, my hobby at that point was taxidermy. And so a few days later, there was a rat-tat-tat on the door, and one of my school friends was standing there, and in a bread bag, there was a dead, newly fledged swift. A vulnerable thing, as light as air. It had been caught by a cat. Its gut contents were dribbling all over the bag. And I saw that this powerful, martial thing was as vulnerable as I was. So at that moment, my fascism hemorrhaged away, and I began to reflect on my own mortality. I was a very strange child and a very So that's how it all started. The title of this is The Allure of Swifts. And what is the allure? It's the fact that we can't deal with them. It's the fact that they're up there and we're down here, and therefore they play into all our aspirations about what we should be. They won't play our games, and that makes them important. It's a great book, Andrew Harvey. Do you know it? A Journal in the Dark. It's the things that ignore us that save us in the end, as all true mystics know. The more you learn about something, the more you realize that you don't know anything. Proper mystics talk about the cloud of unknown. Plato talked about the whole business of knowing anything as anamnesis, unforgetting, which means that all we big, sophisticated, grown-up adults, as we've grown up, have forgotten more and more about the way the world turns. Swifts can help us to know a little bit better, can help us to be children again. I read a book which has been generously referred to, and that is a book, don't go out and buy it because I can tell you what it says. It's a book which says again and again and again in relation to every parameter of Swift biology, I've no idea what's going on here, really, but I don't think anybody else does either. This is a book about one species, Apis, the common swift. There are a large number of other species that I could have written about. I've told you why I chose to write about this one, because of this peculiar and probably pathological obsession. But is it justifiable to write a book about just one thing? Isn't that necessarily an act of ownership of that creature? Isn't it essentially a colonial thing to do, to try to appropriate it? All I can say is that I hope not, and I hope that this is an act of reverence. I hope that it's an act of submission to the wonder of these creatures. The swift, another of the big attractions, particularly on a day like this, is that it is always summer for them. They travel from here to Africa, never knowing anything other than a blue sky and bright sunlight. And it was always the case. For the purposes of research for this book, I took on a drab winter's day a slow, stopping, chugging train down to the ironically, sarcastically named Sunshine Coast in Essex, to Walton-under-Naze. It was there that a proto-swift was found. It was known to be a proto-swift because it had a very short humerus. This was an Eocene swift. It occupied a neotropical world at a time when Essex had a climate rather like Indonesia. Swifts in those days ate the sword of insects which you see now embedded in Baltic amber. They had to be careful as they swept low, hunting over the hot swamps of Essex, not to be caught by snapping crocodiles. These swifts watched the planet changing. They watched North America drift away from Europe. They watched Antarctica and Australia rise apart from one another. They watched as India smashed into the rest of the Proto-Asian continent, pushing up the Himalayas. Then the world cooled and dried out. Between 50 and 90% of species in lots of groups disappeared. The seas retreated, and these swifts were there to watch it all happen. They evolved, and we erupted into the world. And it seems like the curious and perhaps now disastrous alliance between swifts and us erupted quite early. There are still some places in the world where swifts don't have this very close connection with humans. They still nest in a few places in cliff faces and trees, but it's for common swifts unusual. There are still certain swift towers in Tuscany where they raised swifts. The young are supposed to be very good eating, although I've never done it myself. So there are between 95 and 165 million common swifts on the planet. They're long-lived birds. I'll come back to the significance of that in a moment. They can live up to 21 years. And that means that they invest a good deal of what I can only describe as emotional energy into their relationships. It means that they're capable. I'm being cautious because I'm here. That they're capable of brokering a very close relationship with places. It means that they perhaps have an affective attachment to, for example, the eaves above my house in Oxford, where for many years a pair of swifts was nested. Their survival as adults is very good, hovering around 80%. But you'll be familiar with the fact that they are severely stressed by us. Swift numbers here fell by 41% between 2008 and 2018. Why? Well, we poison our crops, we annihilate the insects, we disrupt the climate, and therefore create much more hostile conditions, particularly in Africa. I'll return to that in a moment, which reduces adult survival over there, makes migration, particularly in the Mediterranean, a much more hazardous business. One of the main constraints is on nest sites. We're far too tidy. We insulate in a way which takes away swift nest sites. We block up holes rather than rejoicing in having ragged soffits around our houses. One of the things that I began to reflect on when I was considering just why these birds excited me so much is simply the metrics of their life. Let me give you a few of them. A swift might do 38,000 miles in a year. If that swift lives for 21 years, that's 771,000 miles. That's 3¼ trips to the moon. They prey on about 500 different species. And they're not just trawling when they prey on those species. They're not just going like a basking shark through the air with their mouths open, hoping that they're going to bump into insects. They hunt very specifically. They perhaps go at 60 miles an hour, and at 60 miles an hour, they're capable, when they're hunting bees, of distinguishing between the stingless drones and the nasty, dangerous, bestinged bees. Imagine being able to do that at that speed. It requires, as well as an amazing ability to snap, an amazing ability at simple entomology. If you're a good twitcher, you might know from their jizz maybe 100 species of bird. Swifts seem to know at least 500 species of insect and know them at high speed and way up in the air. In a very Catholic year, if I'm being very adventurous in my own diet, I might eat, what, 20 species? Swifts eat 500 species. 3 species, rice, maize, and wheat, are the staples of 3/4 of our population. A fifth of all US meals are eaten sitting in a car. One of the most disgusting statistics that I know. But swifts have all their meals up there in the sky. They bathe by diving through clouds or by diving under clouds and waiting for the rain to cascade out onto them. It's not surprising that in an effort to capture this sort of romance and epic, the poets have stumbled. It seems to me there are 3 great themes whenever poets have taken to trying to describe swifts. There's a theme of aspiration. There's a very moving book by a woman who suffers from MS and has done from being a young woman. And the swifts are, not to make it too high really, to say the swifts are the animals that keep her alive. They lift her mentally and spiritually from her wheelchair. She waits there, almost paralyzed every spring, looking up into the air. If they didn't come, she would die. But when they do come, they give her a reason for continuing. They lift her out of her wheelchair and she can fly with them in the sky. That's one way in which we try to capture the essence of swifts. The second is rather more dubious. It's Ted Hughes's method. You all know the famous poem. The swifts are back, therefore I can be assured that the world is continuing to work. So we use them as sedatives to put to sleep our own neuroses about ecological destruction. And I'm uneasy about that. It seems to use swifts as tools. And then there is a strand in the poems of denigration. And this is the bulk of the poems about swifts. Swifts are yobs, swifts are vandals, swifts are monsters. They're like leather-jacketed Hell's Angels. They tear blasphemously around the tops of church towers at evensong. They are Satan's cherubim. And where does that come from? Perhaps it comes from a deep-seated resentment that we lumpen, literally grounded beings are the way we are, and they're so much better and faster and freer than we are. We tend to think of swifts as ours. I live just down the road here in Oxford. We've got a number of swifts living down that road, and the neighbours are very attached to them and would be very upset if, as sometimes happens, the starlings take over the swift nest site in their house. But the neighbours all talk about our swifts, my swifts, and it's great because these are animals that, if anything, possess the humans rather than the other way around. There's nothing we can do to control these creatures. Most of the time, they're not here in Europe at all, of course. They're here for 3 months. Why do they come here? Why do they, if you could opt to spend your life anywhere between Mozambique and Sweden, why on earth would you choose to come to Western Road in Oxford? Why would you choose to expose yourself year after year to an English summer? The answer is that we have longer days and therefore more hunting time. And up until now, anyway, up until the time when we started killing off all our insects, there was a reasonably predictable supply of insects. But the relationship is very brutally utilitarian. It's wham, bam, thank you, Europe, and then back to Africa. Where do swifts live? Neither in Africa or in Oxford. They inhabit the sky in a way that no other creature that I know does. They graze on the aerial plankton, ballooning spiders and the like, which are carried up by the thermals. They sleep on the wing, circling round and round, perhaps with a half of their brain shut down. That's not, it's contentious, but perhaps there's half of their brain still working, as happens in frigate birds and some cetaceans, so they know roughly where they are. Sometimes they mate on the wing, though that story's been made over prominent in swift mythology. But if it's right to say that they live anywhere at all on this planet other than the sky, these are African birds. And if you want to understand where they thrive, where their natural habitat is, and you can't be up there in the blue, it's to Africa that you must go. And if you want to find out where they are in Africa, what you do is you find out how the map of green sweeps over Africa as the year goes on. Follow the rain, follow the green. Between 4 and 6 weeks after the green arrives in Africa, up come the insects, and there the swifts are to be found. They play a dangerous game. If you rely on rain, you are flirting with storms all the time, dancing with storms. And sometimes that's deadly. They're very vulnerable, particularly to the El Niño cold Pacific currents. So the fate of swift in Africa depends on big blocks of cold air, which are boinging together like billiard balls in the Southeast Pacific. They in turn produce rain, torrential rain in Southeast Africa, drought, you see the deaths of cows and massive human suffering further north in East Africa, and often the death of vast quantities of swifts. But why? Why is it that these birds that seem to treat cyclones with such contempt sometimes get killed by them? My own fanciful idea is that the explanation might be something like that in the old story about how weasels and stoats fascinate birds down from the trees. Have you heard about it? The weasels are said to chase their tails round and round at the bottom of the tree. The birds are looking down. They get so dizzy that they drop off the tree and can be eaten by the weasel. I like to think that the circling of the storm mesmerizes the swifts so much that they're drawn, fascinated into the eye of the storm and eaten by it. So lots of our swifts here will overwinter eventually in an area of Africa that I spent a lot of time in, northeastern Mozambique. And it was there that I went to try to catch up with them. When they begin the journey north for the spring migration, it's a very, very gradual filtering process at first. It doesn't look as if there's any great active decision. Right, let's go. They begin diffusing along the green corridor. Look at it on the map. Following Lake Tanganyika northwards and then gradually drifting west. There's a great mustering in the DRC above those great forests where the trees from above look like very dark broccoli, where there are rivers which coil back on one another, where there are tiny little forest elephants, where there are still highly political communities, both of bonobos and of guerrilla fighters. So there's a great mustering in the DRC in the early spring. And birds which are bred all over Europe come together. The wings of the Swedes and the Dutch and the Spanish and the Italians, as well as the Near Eastern birds, all rub together in the air over DRC. And then they go to Liberia. I expect you thought that the great wildlife experience is to look at the migration of the wildebeest across the Masai Mara and the Serengeti. It is pathetic compared to the mustering of birds in Liberia before the start of the great spring migration. Why do they do it? The obvious reason is that there are lots of insects there, and the birds are fueling up for the big push north. Doesn't, to my mind, work as an explanation. Lots of the insects which do occur in Liberia come after the mid-April rains, by which time all the European birds, or most of them, have already begun their big push. And also they don't seem to need that big fueling effort in order to push themselves out. They don't seem to load up massively before leaving in any event, wherever they are. The spring migration is a much more frenzied journey than the autumn migration for obvious reasons. They have in their minds, and yes, I do think they have minds, a picture of my house in central Oxford. They've either bred there the year before, or if they haven't bred there before, they have scouted out Western Road in Oxford as potential breeding site. And there must be a sense in which they have a picture of my eaves. And that means they must be planning. It means they must have foresight. This is not an algorithmic process. They go very fast once they set off. The fastest Swedish swifts in the spring averaged 403 miles a day. And there's a British swift which is known to have done the journey from Liberia up to Britain. That's 3,100 miles at 620 miles a day. How do they do this extraordinary process of navigation? The answer you will anticipate now is, of course, nobody knows. Probably lots of things. Probably stars. They may have magnetonic particles in their beaks or their brain. They seem to know something about landmarks. One of the reasons that I say that is because lots of birds, when they're flying over particular ferromagnetic areas, which disrupt their natural compass, reduce altitude. Presumably because they recognize, how do they recognize? That their magnetic sensors are unreliable. And therefore, they've got to be lower so they can see the local landmarks, which they can use as visual cues for their migration. It may be that the effect of polarized light on flavor proteins in their eyes give them some indication of latitude. It's no doubt a number of these things. I imagine lots of you have, in the summer, looked at swifts at the very end of the day, which is when most of us look at our swifts. We're sitting out in the garden, a glass of wine in one hand and binoculars in the other, watching the swifts going beyond the reach of your binoculars, these famous twilight ascents, and then they come back at dawn. They yo-yo up and down. It's long been supposed that that is something to do with looking at inclement weather. Perhaps if you're right up there, you're a better weather predictor. You'll be able to know where the crop of insects is going to be most dense the next day. Or is there a storm approaching from over there which I need to avoid? One intriguing observation is that wings flap a lot more up there than they do normally. And the flapping of swift wings usually correlates with swift conversation. They're much more vocal when their wings are flapping. But maybe they just circle up there, the edge of the thermals, the edge of your vision, in order to chat, in order to exchange information. If you slow swift talk down to a tenth of the normal frequency, it sounds just like a fat, lazy barnyard hen clucking. So it may be that's what it sounds like to another swift. Certainly, swifts can distinguish between sounds which are much, much closer together than we can. And it's been calculated that if swift conversation contains the same amount of data per unit time as human speech does, a 1 hour lecture could be delivered by a swift in 1 minute and 4 seconds. So the screams that you hear in the summer might be great squirts of information. So they settle in Oxford and they set up house. The two birds that have arrived will not arrive together. They'd probably been apart from one another for the whole of the African winter. They may arrive here several days, perhaps several weeks apart. But they will be partners. Like most long-lived birds, and indeed like most birds, they mate for life. There's no evidence that there's been any contact with them, between them, for the whole of the time between they leaving England and coming back. Those the British birds. I'll return again to their domestic story. There's another cohort with whom the British birds rubbed wings in the great meeting over the DRC, and that's the Near Eastern contingent. They will branch off from the British birds a couple of weeks earlier. And they'll turn off to the northeast. They'll cross the Nile. They'll cross Sinai. Some of them will end up in Jerusalem. And there's an interesting story to be told about the colony which nests in the Western Wall in Jerusalem. King Solomon was thought to be wise because he understood the speech of birds. The Western Wall is the retaining wall of Herod's temple, at the bottom of the temple mount where Solomon's temple stood. There's a community of about 100 pairs of birds nesting in the Western Wall. These must be the direct ancestors of the birds that taught Solomon to speak in bird language. And if you could speak in bird language, as we've just seen, he was able to take in an awful lot of information per unit time. Maybe that was the root of his wisdom. Another interesting observation. Right at the heart of the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, in the Holy of Holies, in the deep dark, there was the Ark of the Covenant. And over the Ark of the Covenant are the cherubim. Cherubim are Mesopotamian creatures. And go down to the Ashmolean, we will see lots of cherubim there, an even better collection in the British Museum. The Mesopotamian cherubim all have very, very stubby wings, square at the end. All the depictions, the cherubim over the Ark of the Covenant have swept back scythe-like wings, like those of the common swifts, which fly over the Temple Mount to this day. So maybe the original cherubim in the Jewish tradition are inspired by the swifts who taught Solomon the wisdom for which he was so famous. But back to Oxford. The swifts here are very colonial. Colonies are good for protection, maybe, against predators. They are assurances of some sort of protection against predators. They're good schools for the art of relationship. And relationship is very important for the survival of long birds. Maybe these birds learn something from the colony which they bring into the pair bonding, which is so crucial for their reproductive success. If you have the necessary RAM to understand the demands of colonial life, to curate all the relationships which are embodied in that sort of life, it's unsurprising that you can bear the demands, but also reap the benefits of monogamy. As you look up into the summer sky, you see these swifts playing with one another, flying around in flocks. It'd be easy to think that you should think of them as simple elements in a flock. In fact, they have very great idiosyncrasies. So, for example, there are some swifts which year after year won't go to the nest box before the eggs are hatched. It's as if they want their last fling before the kids finally arrive. Mm-hmm. And there are all the liabilities of the school run, all the rest. And they seem to go out, the mum and dad, on the tiles together before they come back and resume their parental responsibilities. Other pairs are much more responsibly solid and suburban and domesticated right from the beginning, and sit diligently, hot hour after boring week on the nest. There are usually 2 or 3 eggs. They're very cold resistant. The incubation is shared very democratically between the male and the female. 19% of the nestlings are going to die. All 4th nestlings, if there is a 4th, are going to die. The nestlings themselves are very robust organisms. They can survive great plummeting in their body temperature, and they can go into a state of dormancy for a long time, just turning down their thermostat, therefore reducing the speed of their metabolic motor. So they can almost freeze, which is how evolution has enabled them to deal with the English summer. But the adults appear to be very ruthless in the way that they deal with the Darwinian imperative. So I imagine underneath my eaves, the cock and the hen birds have a set of pie charts and graphs and targets pinned up. They seem to be ruled by very stern algorithms. So they will decide not to feed that 4th one. They know it's due. If it's a bad June, June is what it's all about so far as swift survival is concerned. But if it's a bad June, they'll decide to sacrifice number 3. Well, I just wonder, because I'm a romantic, what the thinking is, because it has to be described as thinking that makes them say, we're not going to feed him. And how do they decide that it's him that's not going to be fed? Do they weigh in their mind that one? He's slightly lighter than the other one, therefore his chances of survival are in any event less. And at some point, they might make the decision to save themselves rather than any of the offspring if it's been a particularly bad June. And the calculation there is the icy Darwinian one. We're long-lived birds. Okay, it would have been nice if this clutch had worked out. But if we exhaust ourselves trying to make this clutch survive, or one or two from this clutch survive, it's going to reduce our chances of getting safely to Africa and back again next year. And we may have another 15 years of reproductive life. And 15 years of reproductive life, let's say an average of 2 surviving each year, that's 30. Oh, 30 is against this clutch of 3. Let's save ourselves and let them die. So that sort of calculation is going on all the time under my eaves. The young are grotesque. We've seen them either in the webcam, which the University Museum has, or even more clearly when they are pushed out of the nest prematurely and die, as they sometimes do. But they're horrible. They have transparent skin. You can see their liver like a big black bruise through the skin. Their gut is so big for their weight that it pushes their cloaca, their back passage, onto their back. So imagine having your anus right here. That's what it's like to be a young slip. If a human infant increased its weight at the same rate as these feeding machines, a 1-month child would weigh 11 stone, 17 kilograms, or something like that. They are amazing feeding machines. Eventually, the fledglings are heavier than their parents. And they then have to enter a very dangerous phase of their lives. They've got to work off some of that weight in order to achieve the right drag lift ratio in order to make that first descent into the air. And in order to do that, go and look in July at the webcam. They spend hours in the nest doing press-ups to lose weight, but also, most importantly, to strengthen their wings in order for that descent. The descent out of the nest, which is obviously very nerve-wracking for them, see them poking out their little heads and looking down, is like nothing so much, I think, in the natural world as dying. It's a transition from a suffocating, hot, claustrophobic shell, the nest under the eaves, into air. It's more like the chemical process of sublimation. Solid goes directly to a gas without any interim phase, than it is like anything which is biological. They're accompanied throughout their time in the nest by vampires, louse flies. These are blood-sucking parasites. They can take 5% of a nestling's blood volume. It's quite a lot. Interestingly, there doesn't seem to be any detriment. Nobody knows why. If you took 5% of your blood volume, you'd feel a bit peaky. You'd feel particularly disadvantaged if 5% of your blood volume was taken just before you had to fly for the first time to Africa. It's also strange that they don't take the louse flies off them. They're so big that it's like having a big edible crab something you'd love to have in a restaurant, attached to your neighbours. That's the sort of relative size. And I suspect the reason why they don't is because they've got a very curious arrangement of muscles at the back of their neck. So they're really very, very good at snatching insects to one side of them. But the cost of doing that in terms of their neck musculature is very bad at doing that, going up and down. So they probably can't take the edible crab off their navel. Of course, not all birds breed. The non-breeders come over in order to learn the migration routes, to learn the morals of the colony, to learn the rules of hierarchy, perhaps to learn how to woo, perhaps to pick up in those nighttime conversations some tips about navigation or child management. But towards the end of the season, particularly, sometimes earlier, you can see a phenomenon called banging. And these are the young birds going around prospecting for next summer's nest sites, going so close to the potential nest holes that they physically bang their wings on the soffits. Again, these are animals that are planning. These are animals which expect to be able to hold in their mind a mental picture of that road, that hole, with the view to coming back the next year. And then off they go. Back to Africa, back to the green, back to following the rain, back to being mesmerized, perhaps fatally, by the storms. But all the time, being, for me anyway, the archetype of aspiration. For me anyway, the creature that, just as for that woman I mentioned earlier, who suffers from MS and is lifted out of her wheelchair by the swifts every year, a species that gets me out of myself and reinfects me all the time with the wonder of the world, and therefore the imperative of creating a world in which swifts can continue to live. I'll shut up. If there's time for questions, I'm conscious I've gone on far too long. I'd love to try to answer them, but even more, I'd love to hear your responses to what I've been saying. So thank you for your patience.
Thank you. That was wonderful. So we can open up to questions from the audience. We have a microphone for the online audience, so do wait for the microphone to come. Whatever you want to do. Should we start over there, then over there?
Thank you. Hello, can you hear me? Oh yeah, just general question. Why is it that the shape of swift and swallows' tails differ so much, given their lifestyle or their ecological niche appears so similar? I wonder.
Much longer for tails and swifts. Swallows are typically extremely low altitude feeders. They're very good at weaving around bits of grass in the field, following the insects which are being kicked up by the grazing cows. That sort of low-level meandering seems to be more easily achievable with that long without long tail. So they probably have to do bigger deviations, do swallows, for that low level grabbing of insects. Probably the density of insects in the higher altitudes where swifts feed is higher. So the swifts will go into bigger flocks of prey species, and therefore don't have to do the big fast swings.
Thank you so much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I'm wondering, so you kind of mentioned you're very aware that you're in a room full of scientists, quote unquote. I was wondering how, so you're talking about like the importance of storytelling. How do you think that we should try to incorporate that into our research? How can we be better at telling stories?
There's so much to say. I'll say just one thing, and then hope to continue the conversation some other time. But one of the things which has inhibited, it would seem to me, that the whole scientific project is the way that scientific writing has come to be demanded in the academy. So there has come to be a very sclerosed, rigid form of scientific writing in which speculation of any sort is regarded not as exciting, but as simply sloppy. So I would like to see, I'd like to see more room for the rehabilitation of honest scientific doubt than the present way in which lots of scientific scholarship is done. I would also like the basic observation of Einstein and Bohr to be recognized as the central principle in biological storytelling. By which I mean this. So there was the famous debate between Einstein and Bohr, wasn't there, about whether you could, in principle, devise, identify a law which would explain everything in the cosmos. Yes, you could, said Einstein. No, you couldn't, said Bohr. Bohr was right, and the reason that Bohr was right is that the action of everything is affected by the observation of the observer. So subjectivity is at the heart of all scientific observation. I can't look at an electron without affecting the spin of the electron. I can't look, I imagine, at a swift without affecting the action of the swift, and vice versa. So if one acknowledges that basic principle, which is encoded in quantum non-locality, for example, you necessarily acknowledge the exhilarating uncertainty which comes with all subjectivity, and even when you are presenting your objective scientific findings in the most rigorous way you can. And a second corollary of what I've just been saying, of course, is that since everything is connected, relationality is the web and the weave of the cosmos. If two things have been together at one time, they affect the action of everything else immediately, and whatever the physical distance between them, forever. And of course, since everything has been very close to everything else at the moment before the Big Bang, everything affects everything instantaneously. however far apart it is in space or time. So the whole cosmos is one big conversation with everything else in the cosmos. And that simple observation would seem to me to affect necessarily the way in which we tell our scientific stories. It shouldn't mean that we're chary about being certain about our scientific conclusions, but it should condition, shouldn't it, the way in which we express those certainties.
Actually, I'll just follow up on that. I didn't expect the discussion to veer into quantum physics quite so quickly. But another thing you picked on, you were quite cautious about anthropomorphism and while defending your anthropomorphism. And my perception is perhaps there's more of a relaxed feeling about acknowledging the personhood, the beingness of animals, other species than there was, say, 10, 20 years ago. Yeah. For a variety of reasons. I think perhaps realizing the limits of that intense rejection of anthropomorphism and problems that's caused, this depersonalization of nature. Yeah. Do you detect that in your readings and writings as well? That actually the scientific community is more open to that more subjective view or a more personalized view of other species?
Absolutely, and it perhaps follows on from what I was just saying about quantum physics. So yeah, consciousness seems to be a fairly ubiquitous quantity. The universe seems to be a very fecund garden for growing up consciousness, and the better we get at looking for consciousness, the more we find it. So what do we say about our own consciousness? Well, there's plainly some relationship between my brain and my consciousness. And I promise I will return to animals in a moment. There's plainly some relationship between my brain and my consciousness. If I fall off my bike on the way home and I damage my brain, my way of being Charles Foster will be affected. So it would seem to me that there are three ways in which we could explain the relationship between brains and consciousness. One is to say that our brain in some way secretes consciousness, which is the scientific orthodoxy, or has been until fairly recently. That seems to me to be overwhelmingly the least likely explanation. Our brain could be something which transmits consciousness, rather like a lens transmits the light which is beamed through it. William James said something like that. Or our brains could be something that permit consciousness. So there might be consciousness out there which is in some way affected or constrained by the peculiar physical form in which Charles Foster's brain appears. And that third explanation would seem to me to be the more probable. So if that third model, or anything like it, is right, then there would seem to be a consciousness out there which is permeating through and being conditioned by the brains of non-human animals. Why not? But it also leaves open the more radical and exciting possibility that everything, whether it's got a brain or not, has consciousness. So panpsychism, which was laughable 20 years ago, but is now becoming, I think, the most parsimonious explanation for lots of the phenomena that we see in consciousness studies. I mean, no one has been able credibly to explain how consciousness arises from matter. Why not then say that the simplest explanation is that matter itself has some sort of consciousness, that consciousness is as fundamental a property of the cosmos as relationality.
Have you to think on that? We'll confirm. Back.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. I wonder if we could just follow from that. What are your thoughts about artificial intelligence and consciousness, perhaps in that sphere, and how it might relate to these ideas?
It's not artificial intelligence, is it? That's the first thing to say. It's much more like artificial stupidity. We don't in our ordinary lives say that the mere accumulation of data and the massaging in some way of data amounts to intelligence. Somebody who can merely do that, we wouldn't regard as intelligent. What we describe as human intelligence, in the sense in which we value it, is much more like what we have classically described as wisdom. If you ask what amounts to human reason, it amounts to something very different from simply the ability to follow a set of logical steps from premise to conclusion. It involves the recruiting of lots of inchoate things, intuitions, just for example, intuitions, feelings, the inputs from pheromones, all sorts of things. How does a jury in legal proceedings decide whether somebody has behaved reasonably? They don't do it by anything like the analytic process, which is inherent in artificial intelligence. If they did that, they would get what all reasonable people would see as a wrong conclusion. So I don't see any real threat from artificial intelligence, as long as we continue to value in humans the things which separate artificial intelligence from real intelligence. They're radically different things. My worry is that we don't value those things which separate us from artificially intelligent entities. If we come to value calculation and the capacity for data collection and management in the same way that we value wisdom, then we are sunk. But I don't think we're quite there yet. But to go back to the last part of your question, I think there are animal ways of being which suggest that they handle data, they handle their sensory inputs in a way which looks much more like human wisdom than artificial intelligent processing of data. So I feel much closer to a hedgehog than I do to a laptop.
Thank you very much for your talk. You said in the very beginning that what got you interested in the natural world was the kind of feeling of otherness that the blackbird gave you, that its perspective was something that you didn't have and you wanted to have it. And then you also said that anthropomorphizing is the good place to start. And now, like after this amazing talk and amazing discussion, I wonder, in like as now, as where you are now, do you think that looking for similarities, commonalities between your experience of yourself as a human and animals gives you more understanding than trying to look at the differences, the otherness, try to stare at the part of the swift that you know that you don't know anything about, or the other minds of like plants and fungi or whatever that you know that are so far removed from our experience, but still very real. Which one do you think is kind of a more inspiring way forward for you in understanding the world?
Very good. Apart from various experiments of zoological method acting in an effort to try to enter the sensory worlds of non-human animals. In intent really to convince myself that I wasn't locked up forever in my own head. And that therefore it was possible to have a conversation with my friends and family, and that wasn't entirely at cross purposes. So I thought, oh, if I can enter to any degree the sensory world of something as different from me as a blackbird or a fox or whatever, then maybe I can understand what my children are all about. That was successful to some degree. Certainly it was good for me to try. So empathy, I guess, is like everything else. You get better at the harder you work at it. And these sorts of thought experiments and actual physical immersion experiments are a sort of empathy gym, in which an attempt to get close to something increases, if not your knowledge of that thing, at least one's general empathic capacity. But I think that both of the strategies that you mentioned have to complement one another, really. It's just that my particular method, partly because I write books, has been the one that I've described.
Questions? In which case, absolutely fascinating, and I think that your talk was about Swifts, but actually, as you saw in the discussion, it's about much more than Swifts. It's about everything in the world in relation to it. So it's a really fascinating to go on that. I encourage you to join us around the corner. We have drinks, just an informal reception if you want to have an informal conversation and snacks there. Atmosphere room, I guess. So we'll just follow the crowd, so be around there. And thank you once again.
No, thank you all.